What happened when a force of 500 soldiers led by Russia's Wagner Mercenaries faced off in direct combat against 30 elite US Special Forces operators inside Syria in 2018? What geopolitical concerns brought each side there in the first place? The Battle of Conoco Fields technically marks the first time Americans and Russians met in ground warfare since an American Expeditionary Force was sent to Siberia during the 1917 Russian Civil War. We finally were able to observe how old Soviet horde tactics faced against modern US tactics and weapon systems, and the results were surprising. So the first thing you need to know is in November 2015, the Obama administration first authorized the deployment of US Special Forces inside Syria, where a civil war had been raging since 2011. The goal for these US operators was twofold. There was the publicly stated task of assisting local rebels in their battle against terrorist organizations like ISIL, and the less official goal of preventing Iran from having a clear route to smuggle weapons into Iraq, while also protecting the oil field development. If the Iranian forces inside Syria were allowed to successfully take the town of al-Tanf, there would be a direct supply route link between Iran's capital of Tehran, Iraq's capital of Baghdad, and Syria's capital of Damascus. US soldiers had this side quest mission to prevent that from happening. Only 2 months prior, in September 2015, the Russian military intervened in Syria, but on the opposing side, supporting Assad's regime. Russia couldn't afford to lose another ally in the Middle East, and preventing the collapse there would increase their influence in the region. Wagner had just been established 1 year prior in 2014, and an estimated 5,000 Wagner mercenaries were sent to train, advise, and coordinate Syrian forces. This is a job similar to what the US Special Forces are tasked with. At this point, the Syrian government was widely perceived to be on a collision course for imminent collapse, and that was an unacceptable outcome for Russia. So in 2018, US-supported Kurdish and Arab fighters were operating under the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, in the northeastern Syrian province of Deir el-Zohar. The US controlled the territory east along the Euphrates River here. Meanwhile, Russian Wagner mercenaries and Bashar al-Assad's Syrian forces, supplemented with Iranian armed militia groups, patrolled the west banks of the river. Life in this area is heavily concentrated along the river. Travel just a couple hundred meters either way from either side of the banks, and the terrain becomes an endless wasteland of sand. Hoping to prevent World War III, US forces in Syria made a bilateral agreement with the Russian Ministry of Defense, consenting that the river would act as a deconfliction line, meaning both sides would agree to stick to their side of the bank of the river. But there was a problem. On the US side of the river lay the lion's share of Syrian oil fields, along with the conoco oil refinery, controlled and operated by Kurdish forces and protected by the Americans. Both the Syrian government and Iran, whose fighters made up a large part of Assad's army, never signed to this bilateral agreement. However, because Russia played such a crucial role in Syria's defense, they all tacitly agreed to stay on their own side of the river. According to investigative reporting from German news agency Der Spiegel, at around 0500 in the morning, on February 7th, 250 fighters from various Iranian-backed militia groups attempted to cross the Euphrates River into SDF territory. US intelligence detected them about a week earlier, gathering in an assembly area at the local airport. From there, US military commanders in the region coordinated with local forces on the ground to intercept the fighters and fire warning shots, sending a clear message that they should get their silly booties back to their own side of the river unless they want to fight. However, this only delayed the forces that returned to cross further north up the river, entering the city of Merat later that day. This time, enemy forces numbered 500 strong, and were armed with light and medium weapons, artillery, and a combination of 27 Russian T-72 tanks and armored personnel carriers. This massive group of 500 fighters far outnumbered the small contingent of US forces in the region. According to a report from the New York Times, about 30 Delta Force and US Army Rangers were attached to SDF at the conoco oil refinery. 20 miles down the road, a platoon of Marines and a team of Green Berets acted as a quick reaction force, or QRF, for the area. eyewitness testimony from US forces featured in an interview by the Warhorse that said by 1500 hours, 3 p.m., the Russian-led force began to gather near the refinery. At 8:30 p.m., 3 Russian-made T-72 tanks moved to within a mile of the refinery. Josh, a member of the Marines QRF, watched from a drone feed as enemy artillery teams began conducting combat rehearsals, and Wagner soldiers gathered around to conduct final pre-combat checks and inspections. Josh recalls in the Warhorse interview, "I think part of the tell was that Russian doctrine says that they're going to do things that look like exercises right up to the point." Despite attempts to minimize Wagner Group participation in the fighting, first-hand account testimonies from US Special Forces tells a different story. Using electronic warfare systems during the battle to intercept radio transmissions, US forces detected Russian language spoken over the radio. This serves as compelling evidence that Wagner troops played a crucial role in the attack on the Conoco refinery. By 2200 hours, or 10 p.m., Wagner and Syrian soldiers mounted their tanks and armored personnel carriers, left their attack positions inside the nearby neighborhood, and crossed the line of departure towards the oil refinery. This marked the point of no return. A force of 500 fighters began their frontal attack, advancing over open ground directly towards a small contingent of US and SDF fighters. After the first shots were fired, the fighting lasted a total of 4 hours, bleeding into the morning of February 8th. US commandos on the ground coordinated with air assets, while a contingent of QRF Marines rushed to join the fight from their base 20 miles away. The road was full of barriers and pocketed with holes, making driving in blackout conditions difficult even with night vision. The opening salvos described by US forces on the ground matches similar tactics Wagner used later in Ukraine. Commandos at the plant locked down the hatches on their armored vehicles and waited as a combination of artillery and tank rounds impacted all around them. This barrage continued while ground troops prepared to make a frontal advance towards the next compound. No fix and flank here, it was hey diddle diddle straight up the middle. The Predator drone conducting surveillance on the situation launched all of its Hellfire missiles to destroy as many enemy artillery positions as possible. Once out of ammo, it continued to remain on station to provide surveillance of the fighting. Additional air power was available, but it was blocked by active Russian air defense systems in the area. Wagner forces continue advancing with both infantry and tanks under the support of artillery and vehicle-mounted Zu-23-2 anti-aircraft guns. American forces using 50 caliber machine guns, mounted and controlled via remote from the safety of their 6 armored vehicles, were able to pin down advancing infantry, but had no effects on the advancing tanks. Chauncey, a Marine that responded to the fighting as part of the QRF, described the tanks, recalling, "It was like being stalked by a turtle. With every minute, the tank slowly closed." When the T-72 tanks drew closer, the 125mm cannon became a serious concern. Armor on the US fighting vehicles were not rated to withstand a direct hit from this large caliber tank munition. Fortunately, the advancing troops lacked night vision and were essentially firing blindly into the compound. Quote, "They can't be that bad of a shot, they're not hitting anything," remarked one of the US troops, astonished and convinced that if Russians and Syrians had better night optics, things would have gone a lot worse. Eventually, diplomatic channels from the US reached their Russian counterparts. After some deliberation, Russian Ministry of Defense officials determined that the attack did not involve any Russian military personnel officially, and they decided to turn off the air defense systems to allow US aircraft into the zone. After that, all bets were off, and the Wagner assault positions became a field of death. US commandos on the ground recall Apache gunships tearing into the zone and systematically destroying anything that the ground troops marked down below. One Wagner Group member would later describe the Apache gunships attacking their positions as, quote, "a fucking merry-go-round with heavy caliber machine guns." In all, US forces would respond with AC-130 gunships, F-22 Raptors, F-15 Strike Eagles, MQ-9 Reapers, AH-64 attack helicopters, and even a B-52 bomber. This response shows both the power and vulnerability of US tactics. While the fight quickly turned on a dime as soon as US aircraft arrived, success largely depended on Russian military personnel disabling anti-air assets in the region. After the smoke cleared and fighting died down, the original 500-strong enemy force left 200 to 300 dead on the battlefield. Reports on this engagement vary widely as to the percentage of those being Russian, Syrian, Iranian, or otherwise. Remarks from the US Secretary of State at the time, Mike Pompeo, indicated that Wagner Group lost hundreds of fighters. The BBC was able to confirm that dozens died in the February 7th attack. However, there is consensus that none of the 4 dozen US soldiers and Marines protecting the Conoco refinery were killed, and only one Kurdish fighter was reportedly wounded from the engagement. The extent of the Wagner Group's participation in this attack remains debated. Following Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Kremlin has made significant efforts to obscure casualty reporting by classifying official figures and utilizing non-state armed groups to conceal any losses. This is why some articles report no Russian involvement in the event, mirroring initial official Kremlin statements. Eventually, memorials for dead Wagner members and Russian citizens surfaced. Putin, who was facing re-election at the time, was incentivized to keep the losses as quiet as possible. When Russian investigative journalist Maxim Bordin attempted to uncover the extent of Russian deaths during the battle, he was found dead from a 5-story fall from his apartment balcony. Earlier that day, Bordin had messaged friends that a group of armed and camouflaged men appearing to be conducting training in his apartment building. So, why did this happen in the first place? What was the goal of this attack? It's actually very interesting. The Russian response was mixed and disheveled, essentially amounting to, I don't know, LOL, sorry guys. Russia's UN ambassador called the event regrettable and argued the US presence in Syria was ultimately destabilizing. Despite the curt and vague swipes from each nation at each other at the battle, there is a more plausible story behind the Wagner assault on this compound. Prigozhin, the leader of the Russian military group, Wagner, likely saw an opportunity to send his soldiers for hire across the river to make some serious money. The conoco oil refinery sat just 5 miles from the east bank of the river. According to documents obtained by Associated Press investigations, any oil field Wagner liberated from ISIS would yield the private military company 25% of the profits. This fits nicely with statements later made by Russia and Syria that the assault was the result of a hot pursuit of Islamic State terrorists. Seriously, it's just a coincidence that they were headed for the lucrative oil refinery, right? I swear, comrade, this is exactly the kind of resource-grabbing attack that Wagner forces have been accused of inside of Ukraine, attempting to control valuable salt mines in Bakhmut. While none of this was fully confirmed as the purpose of the attack, this low-hanging fruit appeared to be too tempting to resist for a soldier of fortune like Prigozhin. Going further, it's plausible that Prigozhin assumed Russian anti-air in the region would give his overwhelming force the cover they needed to push the Americans off the refinery. It was only after Russian military commanders agreed to disable air defense systems that the US air power was able to turn the tide of the fight. Not one to pass up an opportunity to say sour grapes, a Russian spokesperson later remarked bitterly, "The true aim of the illegal presence of American forces in Syrian territory is not to fight against the Islamic State, but the capture and retention of economic assets." Sounds like someone's a little jealous they didn't get their precious oil refinery. But what did both sides learn from the battle? When the Russian military liaison in Deir el-Zohar, Syria, disabled the air defense systems so US air power could turn the tide of the fighting, it's also likely that it turned the tide of Wagner military relations within Russia. For Prigozhin, this action was likely taken as deliberate act of treachery. While Wagner is a private, profit-driven security company, the Ministry of Defense, MOD, has to represent Russia on the world stage. This is why, when Americans reported troops in contact, the ministry was obligated to disarm their air defense in order to prevent a larger international incident. Imagine if all 30 of those Delta Force troops had been overrun by the Russians. While Prigozhin likely saw this as the Russian Ministry of Defense intentionally interrupting his cash grab, the other side likely felt Wagner's actions were reckless and revealed the vulnerability of outsourcing military forces to private companies. As a result, tensions soared between the two large armed groups, both representing Putin's interests abroad. While Western leaders may view this internal tension as weakness, this rift is something that Putin may likely have encouraged. As an authoritarian leader, Putin would see merit in keeping his two largest coup-inducing threats balanced against one another, a classic divide and rule strategy.
The reason I'm telling you all this is because I'm playing both sides so that I always come out on top.
Nowhere are the benefits and dangers of this strategy more evident than in the recent coup light that occurred on June 23rd. On the surface, Wagner's soldiers' march to Moscow was an embarrassing show of disunity for the war in Ukraine. Underneath, it shows exactly how Putin can take either side, depending on who is more likely to come out on top, insulating himself from both a military coup or Wagner coup. The United States used this battle as an opportunity to exercise the proliferation power of joint force operations. The Air Force, Army, and Marines all worked together in unison with Syrian Democratic Forces to create a combined arms response that could punch way above their weight class. US forces on the ground said simply in an interview, "I'm a full believer that without the air that responded to us on station, we all would have been a bunch of grease stains on the earth in a line in an oil field in Syria." This advantage in air power also fell on a razor's edge. If the Russian military refused to disable their air defense systems in the region, US forces would be forced to engage those assets with cruise missiles before sending in air support, leading to a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. This lesson should act as a warning to the United States operational planners not to place units too far outside our sphere of control. Night vision also played a key tactical role in the battle. This allowed the Marine QRF to drive 20 miles away under blackout conditions to reinforce pinned down soldiers at Conoco, while Russian and Syrian forces were shooting blind at night. Marines and US Special Operator soldiers were able to engage ground targets accurately up to 1,000 meters away, using infrared lasers and an array of heat and night vision sensors. These infrared lasers, when paired with NVGs, also allowed ground units to mark targets for aircraft and communicate with reinforcements, marking a clear path for them to link up and join the fight. Electronic warfare was also a key component to this battle. Monitoring these radios throughout the attack allowed US forces to understand what the enemy was doing in real time. The head of US Special Operations Command, General Tony Thomas, remarked to the New York Times, "Right now in Syria, we're in the most aggressive EW environment on the planet from our adversaries." The Battle of Conoco Fields is an underrated, major engagement that pitted Russian Wagner troops against US commandos, Marines, and air power that ultimately led to the decimation of hundreds of soldiers. It underscores the importance of air power and owning the night. If you learned anything in this video or found anything valuable, I hope I earned your like. Please, if you have another minute, check out this video. Thank you for watching Spare Parts Army. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, signing off.